doing these periodic shows with you.
We were in Colombia. We did an awesome show, and we got banned for 2 weeks.
Yeah, like the very next day, I was bad luck.
Yeah.
Now you're good luck, man. What's new with your brother?
Not much. Not much. Bitcoin, was it at 6 million? Now?
60K plus. Oh, almost.
Yeah. Getting close to 1 million.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about. We've got the BTFP that expires just in a couple days. We were talking about that off air.
Yeah.
That was the Fed's bailout of the banking system back in March of 2023. And most people don't realize that that was just a temporary program. And so in fact, I couldn't believe when they announced a month ago that they were going to discontinue the program. I thought there was like a 99% chance that they would continue to just kind of extend and pretend and kind of paper over the problem.
Like when Silicon Valley, if the audience remembers when Silicon Valley and all that like plummeted. This was like last year.
Yeah, Silicon Valley Bank and Signature, First Republic. People forget about Credit Suisse.
Yep.
It's a global mega bank. And, people think that, well, that wasn't that big of a deal. But if you actually look at the assets on the balance sheets or look at the balance sheets that got wiped out, it was larger than the GFC. And that's adjusted for inflation. So it was a really big deal. And the bottom line is there was a lot of contagion risk in there. So if the Fed would not have set up this program that expires in a couple days, we likely would have seen a GFC type of scenario back a year ago. And now I think we're probably in inning maybe 4 or 5 of a rolling banking crisis. And I don't think it's hyperbolic to say that when you look at things like commercial real estate. And the regional banks have so much exposure to this, what is now, you can't describe it any other way than just a toxic asset. Just like residential was back in, or these mortgage-backed securities were back in 2008, pretty much the exact same thing. And people think that, I always hear kind of these quote-unquote experts say, well, it's not that big a deal because it's just these regional banks that have this garbage on their balance sheet. But that reminds me of Ben Bernanke. And you guys are too young to remember this, but back in 2000, I think it was 7 or 8, he had a famous line where he said, subprime is contained. And it was not contained, as we know now, looking back in retrospect. So whenever I hear people say that, it always reminds me, it's like saying commercial real estate is contained.
Yeah.
I don't know if it is. I don't know if it is. And
we had talked about that last time we were on with you about how commercial real estate was dying and that it was going to get worse and worse. And then now, so basically the banks that were, because these banks, if I'm not mistaken, Silicon Valley, all these banks, they had been giving out loans on commercial real estate, right?
Well, Silicon Valley Bank's a little bit different.
Tech startups?
Yeah, that was their big problem, was they had a problem on the asset side of the balance sheet, but they also had a huge problem on the liability side.
Okay.
So what I mean by that is if you're a Bank of America, I don't know what the percentages are, but just to keep it simple, like 90% of their depositors have under $100,000.
Yeah.
So when you're under that FDIC limit, your depositors are what they call very sticky.
Okay.
They're not likely to move over to Wells Fargo or to some other bank because there's kind of they've got the ATM card. They're kind of built into that network. They get accustomed to it.
Yep.
But when you have a lot of depositors that have over 250K, so they're not insured by FDIC, that's where you get into problems. Because if they smell any type of risk whatsoever, they're going to take their money and they're going to move it to another bank.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
So that's what happened to Silicon Valley Bank on the liability side. But then on the asset side, they had a bunch of long-term treasuries to match up with those liabilities, which most people thought was pretty safe. But the problem there is they bought those treasuries, let's say at a 2% interest rate.
Yeah.
So then when interest rates go up to 4, 5%, there's an inverse relationship between price and the yield. So if the yield's going up, the price is going down.
Okay.
Now, they had these in a kind of a compartment of their balance sheet. It's like an accounting gimmick. It's called hold to maturity. So they said, well, we're not going to price these to the market value because we're just holding these to the maturity, even though the market value has gone down by, let's just say 50% to keep it easy. Yeah. So what ended up happening is they had to transfer all these commercial bank deposit liabilities, the money of all these tech companies, and it got to a point where they had to sell those treasuries, but they had to sell them at such a huge discount that it completely wiped them out. In addition to that, you had all these big players in there, these whales that made up the majority of their deposits. But a lot of those whales were these tech companies that were just burning through cash, just incinerating money. So all of those
to start up, obviously, because you're not profitable.
Startups.
Yeah, you're not profitable in the beginning, so they're getting loans to start up their businesses.
Or they're just selling equity.
Okay.
And they're just burning through that cash. So yeah, it's great that this new startup just raised $50 million, but 6 months later, they're down to $1 million. So that means that the bank has to transfer out all those $1 million that they're spending, assuming that those customers, or where they're spending the money, those people have an account at a different bank.
Okay.
Right? So they're having to send out all of those dollar deposit liabilities. Well, they also have to send an asset to match up with that if they don't have some sort of relationship with that bank so they can settle. So that was another big problem with the liability side of their balance sheet, which a bank like Wells Fargo or B of A, they've got problems, but they don't have those types of problems.
Gotcha.
But the problem with the banking system is, well, one of its greatest strengths and one of its biggest weaknesses is that it's a network. Right? So you can't just say, well, it's contained to the regional banks, because what's happening with the regional banks actually applies to the liquidity for even the huge banks like Wells Fargo. Now, I'm not saying that they're going to go bust or anything like that, but it becomes harder for Wells Fargo to borrow money in the global banking system if risk is going up.
Gotcha.
Because the only thing that constrains a bank's balance sheet is risk. Because it's all about risk reward. You know, people like to talk about bank reserves or Basel III, different types of regulation. But in my opinion, with all the research that I've done in the global monetary system, it's all about risk and reward for these banks.
Okay.
If they see a way to make $1 billion, they're going to figure out how to get you that loan.
Yep.
It's why you've never gone to a bank, or you've never even heard of anyone going to a bank that, let's say, wants to take out a mortgage, and they're a perfect candidate. They got a 780 credit score. They're making $250,000 a year. They want to buy a house that's well within their means. And the bank comes up and says to them, I would love to lend you this money because we're going to make a killing on this deal. But unfortunately, we can't right now because we don't have any money left.
Wow, that's true.
Or unfortunately, we can't right now because of Basel III. Or we can't right now because we don't have enough bank reserves at the Fed. No bank has ever said that. And there's a reason why. It's because their balance sheets aren't constrained by anything other than perceived risk.
I look at it as numbers on a screen. So for them, it's like, okay, if we need to make money off of this person, it's just numbers for us. I don't know.
Well, that's all it is. So I think what you have to do is you have to start by asking or try to answer the question. It seems very simple, but when you think about it, it's actually very complex. What is money?
Numbers.
Right. So what most people consider money, and I'm not going to get into the technical definition, but what most people consider money, just your average normie, is just whatever my bank account says I have. That's money, just my checking account balance. Well, okay, but we all know there's nothing in there. All that is an IOU from the bank.
Yep.
So what we're all trading, if you go down to Chipotle, or you make a payment on this studio or something like that, we're just trading bank liabilities, IOUs, amongst one another.
True. Yeah.
And it's just we've gotten to the point where we just accept that as though it's money. But at the end of the day, it's just commercial bank deposit liabilities.
Yeah.
That's all that we're trading back and forth. And what gets really weird is, so that's an IOU from the bank, but what they're saying is that they owe you $1. Which in and of itself is an IOU from the government.
Yeah.
So they're saying, we owe you an IOU. And then we as Americans, just on good faith, trade that amongst one another as though it has some sort of value. And it's just literally, to your point, electronic digits.
Yep.
It's money, if you really think about it, is just a network of bank ledgers. That's all it is. And that's why,
especially in a cashless society.
Yeah, and that's why if one of these banks go bust, well, what happens to the money? It's gone.
Yeah.
Because your money was not really some sort of asset. It was just their balance sheet.
Yeah.
So if their balance sheet disappears, so does your $100,000 that you thought you had in the bank, but really it was just an IOU, or what we say a commercial bank deposit liability. So when the risk goes up in the system, and to be very clear, banks don't need money to lend. See, this is where people get confused. Banks don't lend money. They create money when they lend.
Okay.
Right? So if we
That's
took
a big distinction.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because if we say what is money, and then we kind of figure that out, what the normie thinks is money is actually that commercial bank deposit liability, then you say, okay, well, where does money come from? Okay, we say, well, the government prints it. Well, not really. That's a very small fraction of dollars are actually green pieces of paper. So you see those digits that are in your account, or what your account says the bank owes you, where does that come from?
Honestly, out of thin air.
Well, right. They lend it into existence.
Yeah.
So if Myron gets a mortgage, let's say on one of his new rental properties for, let's just say, $350,000, that money didn't exist before. They're not taking money from somewhere else and giving it to you.
Yeah, it's not like someone deposited $300K and then they're like, okay, we're going to lend this money out to Myron to buy a house.
No, they're simply adding $350,000 to your account, and then the offsetting asset on their balance sheet is just simply that loan.
Gotcha.
That they just created. So they didn't have to have anything to begin with. Now you say, well, George, how can they legally print money like that? How can they create money? Well, in their eyes, it's not just as though they're creating an asset, a cash asset for themselves. They're creating a loan asset, but they're creating really an offsetting liability. So just because it's your cash asset doesn't mean it's their cash asset, or it can be traded as an asset. And what's also interesting is, let's say you pay off that loan, all $350,000.
Yeah.
Then you pay it off to the bank, and what do? They take your account balance from $350,000 back down to zero. So they destroy the money when you pay off the loan, just like they created money to begin with when you took the loan out to begin with to buy the house.
Wow.
You see, so when you understand...
I never thought of it that way. I always thought like they're giving you a loan based on money that they have from other people putting money in there. But the reality is they just created it. So whether they had the money in the bank at all, which they're going to have it, but like let's say they didn't have it, they would just create. They're just basically
It's like Houdini and magic.
They're just putting it on a balance sheet
Out of thin air.
Yeah, but most banks don't have it.
Yeah.
Like, so what we have to do is we have to look at a system of this interbank network, or the connectivity of all these bank ledgers outside of the United States. So this is outside the purview of the Fed. And this system started back in the 1950s. But right now there's roughly 50 trillion in this system. And that system has no dollars. There's nothing there. There's no green pieces of paper. There's no bank reserves at the Fed. There's literally nothing. All it is just bank ledger money that they created out of nothing.
So there's nothing like regulating this to, have some kind of oversight where, hey, you can't lend more than this amount, or depending on the bank and how big they are, is there like no?
I mean, there's some regulations, but most of these banks just completely get around them. I'll give you an example.
Okay.
So back in prior to 2020, we had something here that you guys have probably heard of. It was called a reserve requirement.
Okay.
So what this was for not all banks, but most of the banks, or some of them, they were required to hold 10% of the deposits that they had on the liability side of the balance sheet in a cash equivalent.
Okay.
So we'll just say bank reserve, something like that. Okay. So that was the Fed's way of trying to rein them in.
Gotcha.
To make sure that we wouldn't have these bank runs, and to make sure that the system was quote unquote stable, because they figured, okay, it's very unlikely that enough people are going to want their money at one time, or to transfer their money, that they would need more than that 10%.
Yeah, sitting in the.
Yeah, the probability is very low that would happen. So we'll just figure that if we make this rule, the banks can abide by it, and then we can all sleep at night. But what happened is the banks in 1980 had 40 billion with a B, in bank reserves, and that's what they had for the 10% reserve requirement, right? And at the time, M2, which should have been the other number there, so you should add 10% of M2, was 1.5 million. Well, that in and of itself should have been, let's just say 150, right? But then M2 went all the way up to 7.5.
So what is M2 specifically?
M2, basically, it's a checking account savings accounts, and currency in circulation.
Okay. That's like all the different types of accounts that the bank would have, I guess.
Yeah. So basically, when
sorry.
we're talking about those liabilities of the bank, where you could go down there and say, "Hey, I want to transfer my $100,000 to a different bank because it's in my savings account."
Yeah.
That would be a component
of
M2.
Gotcha. Okay.
Right?
Sorry about that. So you're saying okay. So
so M2 goes from 1.5 trillion all the way up to 7.5 trillion in 2007. Okay. But the amount of bank reserves, it was supposed to be 10%.
Yeah.
That's supposed to be our safety blanket or our cushion. That went from 40 billion to 40 billion.
Didn't change.
Didn't change at all. Didn't change at all.
So it went down from like 10% to maybe 5% or 3%. Or
no, it never was at 10%. It never was even close to 10%.
Yeah.
And what's crazy too is a lot of that was we won't get into it, but the number in reality, in practice, was actually lower than that 40 billion. So that's even looking at it optimistically.
Wow.
But no, what the banks did is they said, no, we're not going to play your stupid game. If we've got a profit-making opportunity, we're going to take advantage of it.
Yeah.
So what they did is they set up something called sweep accounts, where basically they would take the checking account balances and they would move them over to other accounts that weren't technically a part or didn't technically apply to those reserve requirements. And the Fed just kind of looked the other way because at the end of the day, the banks call the shots. The Fed doesn't call the shots.
Gotcha. Wow.
So the whole point there is so people realize that the only thing that's constraining banks from doing loans or, we can talk about derivatives all day long, but doing all these types of, let's just say financial engineering to a certain extent, but a lot of it is helping the economy, assuming that it's productive lending, which is debatable what percentage of bank lending is productive nowadays. But this is the only thing that they care about is risk. That's it. So my point there is if you have a Newark Community Bank, which is on the brink of going bust, if you have a Silicon Valley Bank, a First Republic, a Signature, people may say that, oh, this is no big deal because these are smaller banks and it's contained. But what you don't understand is the amount of risk in the overall system is increasing. So since the risk is increasing, that means even for the big guys like JP Morgan and all these banks that actually benefited from all those deposits going from Silicon Valley Bank over to their bank that was perceived as safer.
Gotcha.
Right? They are the beneficiary, but they look across the network. They say, no, we're not going to do that loan. We're not going to do that FX swap. We're not going to do that currency swap.
So even though they got more money, the risk is still, it makes them say no. Okay.
Exactly.
Wow.
So what that is that creates a credit contraction, not just within the economy, but between the banks themselves. And what's fascinating is if you look at M1, so we were talking about M2 before.
Yeah.
And savings and checking, just a component of that. But if we break it down even further to M1, that's almost exclusively checking account and savings account.
Okay.
And you got currency in circulation as well. But if we just look at that as basically what's the average Joe's kind of purchasing power, like how much money do they have in the bank, right? We see that peak out in 2022, and we see it just absolutely plummet since then.
Wow.
And M2 has actually gone down. So people say that the Fed's printing all this money and doing all this stuff, but if you actually look at the numbers, the money metrics are actually going down. And if you look at bank credit, usually it just trends up like this, and it's consistent until you get a recession, it flattens out a bit. It's flattened out and just barely gone up. That is not a good sign of economic activity, right? That's almost a sign of economic contraction. And to give you some context, M2 right now I'm jumping around a little bit. So I was talking about M1 because that really declined. People can pull that up on a Fred chart and see that it's really kind of shocking. But also if you look at M2, that has declined over the past year as well. Now to find the last time that happened, you've got to go all the way back to the 1930s.
Wow.
And the Great Depression.
Okay.
So that gives you an idea of how risk-off banks are right now, even the big guys that people think are quote-unquote safe.
I mean, I'll tell you, even for me, just for buying houses, like every time I do a new deal, they're asking me for a bunch of fucking paperwork. And it's like,
that you didn't have to
already.
have a year and a half ago.
Yeah, like they're asking for more and more every single time. So I could tell you just off of, obviously it's a limited anecdotal situation, but I could do a deal and then literally a month or two later, I'm doing another deal, similar house, similar stats, but they ask for something that I already gave them. And I'm like, what the fuck? I already gave this to y'all.
Even the car industry. I'm pretty good with my banks. They trust me a lot. I never miss a payment ever. But it's like they know me for these amount of years. I never miss a payment, and I get a pretty good down payment on whatever I get or rate. Nowadays, I have to put even more with a higher rate. I'm like,
that's right.
You guys know me, but hey, it's not us. It's the banks. So I get it.
Yeah, and Kenny, you guys remember Kenny?
Kenny,
Yeah, he's in the exact same boat. You know, he has over $2 billion under management, $2 billion with a B. I mean, Kenny's a big player in the multifamily space.
Real estate that he controls $2 billion of real estate.
That's correct.
Wow.
And he's been doing this for literally decades.
Yeah.
And even with the banking relationships that he has, when he goes to the table to try to do another deal, they're saying, okay, well, we were giving you 70% LTV. Now, 40.
Yeah.
Wow.
And now when he goes and he, let's say they give him a 7% interest
so
rate.
He's got to come with 60%? To pick up
No. If he's got equity, let's say.
Okay. Sorry.
They were willing. Let's say he had $100,000 in equity. They were willing to give him 70.
If he wants to do a cash out refi or something.
Now they're only willing to give him 40.
That's crazy.
Yeah, and if he takes out a loan at, let's just say, 7% interest, he's having to put down like $1 million in escrow just for the bank's buffer in case interest rates go up.
Wow.
So the bank is trying to offload that interest rate risk onto the borrower instead of keeping that on their own balance sheet.
Wow.
Yeah.
And that's why you see when you look at overall bank credit on the Fed's website, you see that it's going up, and now it's just straight flat across. And again, that's not a sign of a healthy economy, because whether we like it or not, in a debt-based monetary system, it's kind of a synergistic relationship between the banking system and the economy. You can't really have a healthy economy without a healthy banking system, and vice versa.
So for the common folk that want to get loans for maybe property, a car, maybe any investments themselves, are you saying that it's going to be harder to get these investments going forward, or even right now?
Yeah, it's getting harder. I think most of the people on the chat would have a similar experience, unless they're getting like a Fannie and Freddie loan. And the banks, I would imagine, are pretty consistent there because they don't keep that on their balance sheet. They just kind of, they flip that. So they're just taking like an origination fee like a mortgage broker.
Gotcha.
But outside of that, yes, I think loans are going to be more difficult to get. And, you know, a lot of people say, well, what's going to be great is the Fed's going to drop interest rates in 2024. We're going to have this soft landing or no landing because we've seen the inflation rate go from 9.1% all the way down to where it is, let's say roughly 3.2, 3.3, something like that.
Yeah.
So if it continues to come down slightly, closer to the Fed's target at 2%, they're going to be able to drop rates. Well, you got to be careful what you wish for there. Because if we go back and look at history, every single time the Fed has dropped, or most of the times when the Fed drops rates, that's because the stuff's hitting the fan. That's not a good thing. That's a bad thing. And just because interest rates are low, that doesn't mean money is loose. That's a common misconception that you hear all the time. Well, the Fed's going to drop rates and we're going to have loose money. I'm sure you guys hear that, right?
Yeah.
No. What happens usually when rates are low, money is tight. And let me give you an example.
Damn.
In 2012, that's when I first retired and got into real estate investing. And at the time, I was just buying these houses cash. You know, the banks were almost giving them away. And my kind of model that I had in Kansas City is I was going into nice neighborhoods, be in A neighborhoods and places like Blue Springs, Lee Summit. And I was buying these houses for right around $50,000. Roughly, this is kind of my model.
Wow. Shit.
$50,000. And they're usually like 3.2s or...
No rehab, no nothing?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
you rehab, okay.
Yeah, so then what I do is I drop out 25 on a remodel, just getting it up to where it looks good for a renter, nice, solid. And I'd have a renter in there almost instantly for $1,100, $1,200.
Yep.
And I just rinse, repeat.
Yep.
And a lot of these homes, too, that I wasn't buying off the MLS in foreclosure or a short sale, I was just getting straight from the county because they were foreclosing on them for not paying their taxes.
Gotcha.
So it was just literally like a TV show where you're going down to the courthouse steps and you're bidding on it. So I had a lot of properties like that. But the punchline here is after I kind of got done with this process, moving into 2013, I had about 20 of these houses that I owned outright. I paid cash for every single one of them.
Yeah.
0 loans. And I've got a great credit score. I'm like the perfect borrower. And I've got renters in almost every single one of these properties.
Yep.
I take that to the bank. And back then, Fed funds was at 0%. So you would think that you'd have banks just throwing money at you.
Yeah.
I took that to every single bank in town, and they basically told me to pound sand.
Wow.
They weren't interested in lending in any type of real estate whatsoever.
They were still that scared from the 2008 crash.
Right. And so then I said, okay, I don't even want to cash out refi. I just want a line of credit against the equity. And I'll just take 40%.
Yeah.
Now, let's not just get crazy here. I said, let's do 40%. And if I draw down on it, I'll just prove to you that I'm going to build this relationship. I'm going to pay you back on time. And after 3 or 4 cycles of that, then maybe you can up it to 50 or 60 or something like that, a little bit more reasonable to where it's worth my while. They wouldn't even do that.
Wow.
I couldn't get a bank to do it until I think it was right around 2014. And it was only because a good buddy of mine's a lawyer down there, and he plays basketball with the VP of commercial lending for one of the community banks.
Okay.
So he got me a meeting with him, and he and I really hit it off.
Okay.
And he's like, George, I trust you. Let's go ahead and do it. And because of that, by the way, I've maintained that relationship, and I still bank with him to this day.
Nice. That's very important.
Wow.
Yeah, that's
very
right.
important. I could call my guys right now on the phone. I need a deal done. They'll get it done for me.
I won't tell you his name, but I literally text him. And whenever I go back to Kansas City, we'll grab dinner, we'll grab lunch, something like that. We'll stay caught up. I mean, even if I have an issue with the account, like logging into the website, he'll just immediately text me back, because now I brought a lot of people over.
Of course.
Like my sister started investing there, and some of my buddies from Medellin,
Okay.
and they all use the same guy.
Yeah.
Because we have that relationship. So that would be another good lesson.
That's a power play.
Yeah, for a lot of your viewers, is to right now, while you can, set up relationships with these small banks in your area. Even if you can't afford to buy a rental property, or even if you're kind of making your way up the ladder, just start those relationships now, because they're going to pay dividends. And also, too, I think if I would have had that relationship built back in 2012, I think I could have done the deal.
Right.
It's just I didn't have any relationships built.
It's about who knows you and trusts you to make things happen.
Probably one of the most thorough explanations of how the banking system works on fucking YouTube, man. Shout out to George. Giving you guys a clinic. I learned a bunch myself.
That was great.
That was literally one of the best overviews I've listened to as far as how the banking system works in the United States. Wow.
Yeah. So I think another tip that I might give your viewers, and this is what I do with my own personal portfolio, is I have 2 main banks. I've got that small bank where I can actually have that type of relationship with the higher ups.
Yeah.
But there you got a little bit of risk, especially with what's going on with regional banks and commercial real estate and all these things. Now, one of the great things about this bank is, when he was basically interviewing me, I was also kind of interviewing him. And I asked him, okay, how did you guys weather the GFC? And they didn't take a hit at all. They had a bulletproof balance sheet.
Nice.
Which makes me a lot more confident working with them now. But my point there is I separate it between 2 banks. I go with a mega bank, which is Wells Fargo.
Yeah.
Because I know that even if we do have big problems, they're going to get bailed out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're too big to fail.
Yeah.
Then Bank of America.
They're not going anywhere.
Chase, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, Chase. Who else? I'm trying to think. TD's Canadian. But yeah, these banks are all too big to fail.
But there's a caveat there, though. They're a big bank that can't fail. However, personal relationships aren't that well laid out.
Yeah.
That's right. So that's why I have 2 banks. I've got one for the personal relationship, and then I've got one for the too big to fail.
Yeah.
And then I kind of just divide it from there.
Wow.
So that's my
really
personal
smart, man.
strategy
Yeah.
that, again, some of your viewers might use. But that takes us up to the BTFP, which expires March 11th.
Yeah.
And we talked about the whole banking system. We talked about how it's not really about regulations. It's really not about bank reserves. It's really not about cash. It's about risk. And we see that risk going up and up and up. So then the question becomes, what happens March 11th when they kind of do the rug pull on the BTFP? Now, if you would have asked me a month and a half ago.
So is basically the federal government going to stop supporting these regional banks that kind of took a downslide? Is that what's going to happen?
The
on
Fed's
March 11th?
just ending the program.
The bailout.
They're
ending the program.
Okay.
So they're taking the training wheels off for these banks.
What does that mean for the common folk, though? Like us as people, what does that mean for us?
Well, I would make sure you don't have over $250,000 in your bank account.
There you go.
Make sure it's insured.
Yeah, with those banks.
I mean, look. Okay, so let's break this down. Let's assume that you have $100,000. You're good to go because that's going to be insured. And at the end of the day, even if FDIC can't cover it, Janet Yellen is going to step in and figure out some way so the depositors, especially under 250, don't take a haircut.
Yeah.
That is an extremely low probability.
Yeah.
But let's just say that you're someone with $1 million. Okay, well, now what do you do?
Yeah.
And let's just say that you've only got 2 banks. Well, and let's just assume for a moment that you can only break that down into 2 accounts. So you've got 250 over here, you got 250 over here, but you got another 500. What do you do with it? In my view, you put it into T-bills.
Okay. Treasury bills.
Yeah. Hold on. What about crypto? No?
No. Because this is just your cash. This is your cash. This isn't what you want to use as a speculative play or an investment or anything like that. I'm just assuming that you want this in cash.
Got it. Okay.
Right. So if you want this in cash, you can't get that FDIC insured, or you have to jump through a lot of hoops to do it.
Yeah.
So an easier way to go about that, and I think a safer way, is to just buy like a 1-month T-bill or a 3-month T-bill and continue to roll it over. Because the 250, your counterparty is the bank. We talked about that.
Yeah.
You know, they don't have the money, it's just an IOU. So if they go bust, your money's gone. It disappears.
Poof.
That's right.
Yeah.
But with a T-bill, your counterparty is the government. And if we want to talk about too big to fail, I would argue that the JP Morgan will go bust before the U.S. government will.
Right.
You know, even if they're technically insolvent, they're still not going anywhere. Right?
Okay.
So that's a way that you can have that type of insurance and sleep well at night. Even if you, let's just say for whatever reason, you're running a big business and you want to have, let's say you're Kenny, and you've got all these monthly expenses. So you've got to have the cash, right? Because you got so much incoming and so much outgoing.
Yeah.
So let's just say, I don't know what the number is, but let's just say that Kenny, just for working capital, needs $10 million. Okay, well, he could spread that out through 1 million bank accounts and have to go through all those logistics, or he could just have a couple main accounts, dump it in there, go to T-bills, like 1-month T-bills, and if he needs the liquidity, his CFO can go ahead and sell those T-bills, goes right in the account. You're never at the max threshold, and then you don't have to worry about that, whatever, that's 9.5 million not being insured, or you don't have to worry about that counterparty risk, especially when we're likely in inning 4 or 5 of a rolling banking crisis with the BTFP expiring in 2 days.
Gotcha.
How fast does the money come to your account from T-bills? Is it like a 5-day wait? Is
No.
Instantly?
No, that's why they're the most pristine collateral in the banking system, because they're the deepest, most liquid market in the world, literally.
Wow.
Yeah, you just call your guy, your manager.
You don't even call your guy. You can just press the button
on
and
your
boom,
phone?
it's done.
Okay.
I mean, just instantly sell it. You're going to have more liquidity there than you're going to have in any other asset in the world.
So I go on the Fidelity app and just like buy it that way?
Well, so I don't know which brokers. Some brokers, it's that easy. Some brokers, they don't deal with T-bills.
Okay.
I don't know which do and which don't, so I don't want to give anyone any advice there. But a lot of them do. So you just got to do the homework. And if you want to incorporate that into your overall financial strategy, just go ahead and set up an account with a broker who can make that happen.
Awesome.
Like an online broker.
That's some good advice, man.
Yeah, I know Merrill Lynch, they'll do it for you. You just call them and they do it for you.
Because typically...
And they probably set up a thing where they just roll it for you, too.
Yeah.
Like you just say, hey, I want the 1-month T-bill, and just like automatically roll it.
So how does that work? Like, let's say you want to buy $10,000 worth of T-bills.
Yeah.
Like you buy the 10,000, does it just holds at that value of when you purchased it? Do interest rates play a role in it whatsoever? Does it go up? Does it go down? Like, does it? How does that?
Yeah. So the only way interest rates play a role is if you sell prior to maturity.
Okay.
So let's say you have a 1-month T-bill.
Yep.
Just to keep it easy, let's just say it's $1,000.
Yeah.
So what you would do is you would buy that for like $900 and let's say $95.
Yep.
And so they don't pay you like an interest rate over the next 4 weeks.
Yeah.
It's just you buy it for like $9.95, and then when they pay you in a month, they give you $1,000.
Gotcha.
Wow.
So that's the
if you were to liquidate.
That's the well, no, just it's maturing.
Oh, okay.
So they're going to pay you in full if you don't sell it in the interim.
Okay.
Right. So so there's nothing that
it's a way to basically freeze your money so that if anything happens, you don't lose it.
And you don't have any counterparty risk.
And you're betting on the government, not the bank.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So anything over 250, that's probably the smart play when you have.
All the super smart guys that I know, that's exactly what they do.
I'm
Okay. Even if they're below 250, they do that? Or
no, I'm talking about the Kenny types.
Okay, gotcha,
where that would really apply.
Yeah, because for that, like you need a bunch of money sitting in an account because things need to get fixed, mortgages need to be paid, etc. If you got debt on some of the properties, so yeah, I mean,
with Kenny, I mean, he's got someone managing that.
Of course,
he's got someone managing that cash flow for him.
Yeah.
So that's their job. But with someone that even wasn't at that level, it's not that labor intensive if you're not running a $2 billion multifamily portfolio.
Yeah. We could hit some of these chats real fast, guys.
That's some good stuff, though.
As you can see here, expert in the house. So if you guys got questions, now's your time to get them in.
Because typically, what do we hear?
Money.
Put money into crypto, but this is different because it's backed by the government.
Yeah, safe. It's safe.
Or safer.
Yeah, I mean, look, your expenses are not denominated in crypto.
Yeah.
So you have massive volatility risk.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying that I don't really like crypto. I think everyone should own Bitcoin.
Yeah.
But that's to have purchasing power outside of the system, because then we get into the realm of central bank digital currencies, which I think are simply a matter of when, not a matter of if. So if you don't want the government knowing every single transaction that you make, you probably want to have some Bitcoin there. Also, one thing that I'm doing for my channel in April is I'm doing what I'm calling a CBDC road trip to freedom challenge, where I'm driving from Santiago, Chile, down over into Argentina and then over to Buenos Aires.
In what car?
Well, I'm renting an SUV for it.
Okay.
But the whole it's going to be about a 3-week trip, and the objective of the trip is to do the whole thing with every transaction being outside of the monetary system. So I'm going to try to use only Bitcoin, gold, and silver.
Oh, wow.
And that's the challenge. And why it's Buenos Aires, because that's where my good friend Doug Casey is. And if you know Doug Casey, he's very well known for his views on freedom and liberty and those
legendary.
He's an absolute legend.
Yeah.
That's right. So that's kind of our objective, is to get from Santiago down to kind of the tip of South America, then go straight back up through Argentina to Buenos Aires to meet Doug Casey, using nothing but gold, silver, and Bitcoin. But the point there is that when I'm buying gas or getting a hotel room, that's going to be denominated in the local currency.
Yeah.
So you're subject to whatever Bitcoin may do that day, which as of right now, it can be incredibly volatile. Well, a lot of people, although might be a great speculation long term, or some people might consider that investment, and I totally see the argument for that. I think that's a great... it's a matter of when to buy it. That's a completely separate issue. Mm-hmm. But it makes sense, I think, to have that in the speculative side of your portfolio, Bitcoin, none of the others. But to have that in just your daily working capital for a business, that makes no sense whatsoever, because the volatility is just so high. No business owner is going to do that unless their expenses were denominated in Bitcoin.
Right.
And unfortunately, we're just not there yet. So that's why you've got to compartmentalize all these things. You can't just say, what should I do with my money? No, it's what should I do with my portfolio? And then within my portfolio, you've got insurance, you've got investments, you've got speculative plays. And then what should I do with my cash? How much cash should I have? And then if you're a business owner, how much working capital should I have? Those are all 3 completely separate questions and 3 completely separate strategies.
That's a good breakdown.
All right, we got Jaleel, right?